Well, we certainly never lack for excitement, do we? We can see the real terror of ideas, can we not? The fact that the pathetic rabble outside tonight, that people that resort to violence and breaking windows and screaming at old folks and so on, would think that tonight's speaker is some way that they would want to come out and disrupt and interrupt. But I think it does really say something about the power of ideas. And there are ideas that our speaker will have to share with us tonight that are really very powerful. These are not the screamed threats, the mindless shaking of the arms and so on. These are ideas about about where we came from, about the essence of the world we see around us. A discovery made a few years ago in the state of Washington called Kennewick Man. And this discovery turned out to be extremely important. And although it's not the only one, it is one of a series that will eventually have to reshape the way we look at who it was that was first on this North American continent. Anyway, I don't want to intrude on the political message, and without any further ado, and thanking you all for braving it through the rabble, Stephen McNallen.
I want to stress in discussing this that Kennewick Man, although he is unusual from the standpoint of media profile, he is not alone. Skeletons are mummies that are more or less contemporary with Kennewick Man. That is to say, anything before about 8,000 years old, or anything about that older or older, they seem to be associated with a number of remains that are curiously Caucasoid. Of the perhaps 5, 6, 7, depending on where you want to draw the horizon, set of remains that we have from that time period, almost all of them, to one degree or another, exhibit these Caucasoid traits. So Kennewick Man was not a lone wanderer. He was not somebody who decided that Norway or the British Isles or God's know where was too dull, so he was going to take a long hike. He was a part of a set of people. He was a part of a culture. He has a context. He was not just a sole anomaly, some Fortean event dropped out of the ether. In fact, scientists have noted that as this very old group, as this very old population was displaced, so did the material artifacts associated with these people change. So apparently what we have is an actual change of population and not merely people deciding to start using a new kind of flint work or something of that sort. There was an actual displacement of population that took place back, many thousands of years ago. This led some scientists, in particular Dennis Stamford over at the Smithsonian, to note that what they call the Solutrean culture, or the Solutrean style of making projectile points over in ancient Spain and France, is actually very, i.e. strikingly, similar to what we call Clovis culture here in North America. So what we have is a set of artifacts in North America, the Clovis artifacts, that seem very similar to those of Europe, the Solutrean. We note that Clovis points seem to have spread from east to west across North America, which might be an argument in favor of a European origin. We note that there is very little, if anything, coming across from East Asia down across the Bering Strait and down, which seems to resemble Clovis. So we don't really have a track. There's really no artifact chain to indicate anything coming across from that direction, but we do have it coming from the other direction across Europe. One might be tempted to draw at least tentative conclusions from that. So what we've got is a most remarkable material culture that may in fact be a common culture between Europe and ancient America. We have the shape of the bones themselves. And this is most significant because Dr. Chatters, like most people who do forensic anthropology in your coroner departments and university departments across the country, has essentially a checklist. And on this checklist, there's a descriptor of various characteristics that, for example, a skull might have. There are measurements involved, everything from the length of the skull, the height of the jaw at this point compared to the height of the jaw at that point, the breadth through here, factor after factor after factor that a specialist will look at. And essentially, is this an Indian trait or is this not an Indian trait? And going down Kennewick Man's skull, this list of traits was rather unanimously non-Indian. There were no traits, or virtually no traits, that indicated kinship with the people that we perhaps mistakenly call Native Americans in the United States, and who I have now resolutely called the Indians. So we've got possible artifacts, we've got the morphology of the remains themselves. But science, of course, can only be carried a certain distance because the apologists are very quick to point out to us, well, you have to consider American Indian oral tradition. And at this point, science breaks down because there are some American Indians, by no means all of them, but a sizable number who seem to have a sort of creationism going on in regards with the origin of their people. Our people were always here. We didn't come from Asia. We've been here forever and ever. And at that point, we're all supposed to say, oh yes, thank you for your wisdom, your insight. We'll get you on the Art Bell show. Tell us all about it. But of course, these apologists never tell us the rest of Indian lore. They don't tell us about the lore all the way from the Umatilla up around where Kennewick Man was found, down through Nevada, down across into the plains amongst the various Sioux tribes, down into Florida. They don't tell you the other part of Indian oral tradition, which is, in its different variations, there was an ancient people here before us. They were tall, and they had light skin, and they had red hair, or they had blonde hair, and we killed them. They don't tell you that part. And it seems to me, if we're going to pay attention to one part of Indian oral tradition, we really ought to pay attention to the other part as well. But of course, that's rather unpopular, and you will not find that in the Sunday supplements to your newspapers. In addition to artifacts and morphology and Indian lore, we have as well genetics. There's a particular genetic marker which scientists call haploid X. It has nothing to do with American History X, nothing to do with Malcolm X. This is haploid X, okay? Now, haploid X is a particular genetic marker which is found in some of the very ancient American remains, some of Kennewick Man's contemporaries. It is very rarely found in modern American Indian populations. It is found in living European populations. As of the latest writing, it has never been found in East Asia. Even the rather staid and conservative scientific digest that I dug all of this out of admits this really looks like evidence of genetic contact, genetic connection between ancient America and Europe. So if anyone suggests to you that the idea of ancient Caucasoids is pseudo-scientific, or that there's nothing to back it up, or that it's just the figment of some evil racist who wants to bash on Indians, that's manifestly not the case. There is a considerable body of evidence, and a presumably growing body of evidence, that there is an ancient connection between Europe and America. And this can be backed up with any of a number of different reasoned, scientific, dispassionate arguments. I note that in the same time frame that Kennewick Man emerged, we have Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man from Wales. Cheddar Man found in a cave in Wales, actually found some while back, but only DNA tested within the last couple of years, since all of this is broken. As it turned out, Cheddar Man, through DNA testing, has a direct descendant, a school teacher in a village found a quarter of a mile away from the cave. Also, we have in the same general time frame at least the public revelations concerning the Tarim Basin mummies found in what the Chinese insist is Xinjiang province, and in which the people who live there will tell you is East Turkestan. Back to that question of self-determination again. These are mummies found in the numbers of hundreds. The Chinese are not very fond of talking about this, but the Tarim Basin mummies, just to fill you in quickly for any of you, I imagine 99% of you have followed this, but if you haven't, for one thing, they're blonde, usually a good giveaway. I think this was pre-peroxide, pre-Hollywood for that matter. B, they have all the skeletal characteristics that we have. C, their weaving techniques have been described in the professional literature as the farthest advanced to the east of typical European weaving style. Another possibility, and one which seems to perhaps be backed up by the similarity between Solutrean and Clovis, is that these individuals came across what some scientists are now calling the Atlantic Crescent. And that during the Ice Age, for one thing, the sea level would have been lower, more of this would have been solid land, and what wasn't solid land could well have been solid ice. And so that a highly adapted culture, or a maritime culture, which these people could well have been, could have made the trek that direction. Or perhaps they came both ways. We don't really know a lot about what happened in ancient prehistory. But there are, in fact, different ways that Kennewick Man and his kinsmen could have gotten here. Now, I think that Kennewick Man needs to tell this story. And I think that he has two ways of doing that. And one way that Kennewick Man tells us his story is through science. That's why our organization has maintained from the very beginning that in fact science should have a chance to study it. We don't see that as disrespectful. We don't see that as sacrilegious. I think that Kennewick Man is a reminder to us that we were here before, and the evidence, such as it is, indicates that Kennewick Man and his people were forcibly displaced. It appears that Kennewick Man's people were genocided, exterminated. In fact, the Paiutes of my neighboring state of Nevada have a legend about how they destroyed, how they killed the last of the red-haired giants by herding them into a cave and suffocating them and killing any who ran out and just smothering the ones who stayed in. And this is part of their oral tradition, which science is not looking at very closely.
He's 9,000 years old, one of the first Americans ever found. Now follow researchers as they find out how he's forever changing our notion of who were the first Americans. Only 4 days after the radiocarbon date, the skeleton is confiscated by the government. All scientific work stops as 5 local Native American tribes claim the 9,000-year-old skeleton as their ancestor. Jans has a radical theory. None of these ancient skulls are Native American. He believes Native Americans migrated from Asia years later. Instead, the ancient skulls may represent 3 or even more earlier immigrant groups. It's a revolutionary idea. Long before Ellis Island, America may have had a multitude of immigrants.